All right, it's late, and the procrastination level here in the attic tonight is off the charts. But the red light is on. We're making it happen. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you, whoever you are, new person, old friend. Thank you for choosing to listen today. How's it going for you? Are you in the UK? I got some UK friends, and if I'm not mistaken, this is the week when people are going back to work over there. Things are starting to open up again. And if you're here in America, well, now if you're vaccinated, you take off your mask, right? I was out earlier this evening, and it was an outdoor gathering, but it was amazing, the group of people who I'm friendly with who've been vaccinated and were not wearing their mask. They all felt compelled to tell me that's why they weren't wearing their mask. So, oh man, it's all surreal to the max, isn't it? And I know more and more a lot of people are starting to come back together for yoga classes as well. We had a whole conversation in my teacher's class this week that started out about just being more sensitive to trauma as a person and as a teacher. And then it was really about what it's like to be going back into teaching classes, because a couple of the teachers had their first classes back. Some with masks, some not with masks. And one of the newer participants said the most insightful thing. Nicole, shout out to Nicole. I think she said she's a professor and she teaches this course on death and dismay, as she called it. I think she teaches about times in history when people have had to go through really horrible things. And she said that there's going to be the initial group of people who are really excited about coming back together, and it's a fantastic experience and they love it, and those are likely to be some of the first people back in class. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of people who are maybe not ready to come back now or ever, but there's a lot of people, I think, who have really taken to the online classes and they prefer them, so they don't have any intention of going back to the group classes. And then there is most likely all the rest of the people in the middle who really don't know how they're going to react to it. It's been so long. Who knows? You might go and it might feel great. You might go and it might feel really weird and not great. We're all going to just have to find out. I think there's going to be some awkward first moments. And I think that's going to be the yoga, is to meet those awkward moments of re-engaging socially. Anyways, it's too late. It's too late for me to get into anything deep, y'all. And that's fine, because I have a fantastic talk to share with you today with Jennifer Kurdyla. Jennifer is someone I have come to know over the last few years. First, I knew her as an editor. She was helping me with some writing I was doing. But since then, I've come to know her in practice. She's been a very active and vital contributor to the teacher's class that I'm always mentioning, so I have regular conversations with her. But today we're talking not just about our relationship some, but this new book that she has out called Root and Nourish, that she wrote with her co-author, Abbey Rodriguez. And it's sort of a cookbook, I guess, but it's more than just that. We talk all about it, you'll hear. More than anything, I've just really come to value Jennifer as a friend. She's such a smart and caring person, and I'm just glad that we came together for this conversation and that I'm getting to share it with you today. Real quick before we do, I've already mentioned this teacher's class twice, and if you're newer to the show and you don't know about it, I have a weekly teachers call that I do where teachers from around the world come together, and if they can't be there live, a lot of folks just watch it on the replay. And we really have some important conversations. It's where I get a lot of inspiration from. It's where I get a lot of support from. The people in that group are just fantastic. And if you're out there and you listen to the show and you might like to have some people to talk to and listen to and just, I don't know, feel like you're not alone in it, maybe my teacher's class would be something for you. You can find out about the teacher's class along with all of my other stuff, my live stream classes, and I've got on-demand videos stuff there too, as well as the blog and podcast archives. Also, let me mention that this episode is brought to you in support by podcast premium subscribers. People like Teresa O'Malley and Deborah Kistner. Thank you to Teresa and to Deborah and to all the other people out there who have shown their support by becoming a podcast premium subscriber. Not only is that the best way to support the show, you also get full access to the archives, lots of great stuff in there. It's choose your rate. You can cancel at any time. If you don't have any money and you want to listen to those older episodes, all you have to do is email us and we will give you a free account. But if you are in a position to give something, it's really making a difference for us, and we're very grateful. You can find out about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or participating in the teacher's class or my other stuff. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. Like I said, it is really late. I'm actually a little bit concerned that I might be keeping my wife up just below me in the bedroom. So we will leave it there. I will touch base with you for just a quick moment on the other side. But for now, let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Jennifer Kurdyla. Hello?
Hello, Jay. Good morning.
Good morning, Jennifer.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm curious, are you a morning person, as they say?
I'm definitely a morning person. I've already been out for a run and wanted to ask you what the weather's like there, because here in Brooklyn, it's a beautiful, clear sky, and it feels like the stirrings of spring are actually on the horizon, which is more faith in the weather than I've had in quite a long time. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. And yes, definitely a morning person. Always, I have bread making already in the process. So all of that's going on.
I had a
9 a.m.
I had a feeling, and I will first say to your other point, yes, it is a beautiful day here in Pennsylvania as well. And we've both been packed under quite a bit of snow. So to see it melting away does have that spring is coming soon feeling, doesn't it?
It does.
And, I just had to laugh because, I have that scheduler that I use to book time to record for the show. And I try to have like a diverse amount of time because there's people like all over the world that sometimes I talk to, and there's so many different time zones.
Right.
But very rarely do I have someone like book a start time at 9 a.m. who lives in the same time zone as me. And I was like, oh, I looked 2 days ago. I didn't even really look when you first booked it. And then I was like, oh, Jennifer must be a morning person.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry if it made you get up extra early.
No, you didn't. It's good. I should get up and get going. So I appreciate it, actually. And have you always been that way? Have you always gotten up early, or is that?
Yes. And it's interesting because I don't know how that started. I guess it was always just because you had to be up to go to school. And I guess I never had trouble getting up in the morning. So I wasn't one of those kids who you had to kind of cry out of bed. So I guess in that way I was a morning person, but it was more kind of obligatory than choice. And it just kind of started from there. And I remember, even when I was in college, which I guess is the epitome for most people to go the opposite way and just become night owls completely, I just could never do that. And I could probably count on one hand the number of times I've had to pull anything close to an all-nighter. And it's awful. Like, I will do anything to not do that. I would rather go to bed and then wake up at 4 a.m. to start and finish something than stay up till 4 a.m. to finish it.
Gotcha. That's definitely where we differ. I'm like a stay up late, and then I used to, but that's the problem. It doesn't work anymore. When I was younger, I would stay up late and then just sleep in late.
Right.
But now it doesn't work. Like I still wake up at the same time in the morning, even if I go to bed super late, and that doesn't work. You got to have sleep. Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was actually just listening to another couple of podcasts with this really cool doctor. His name is Andrew Huberman. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a neurologist and kind of an eye specialist at Stanford. And he has been, I think, growing a little bit in popularity amongst the sciencey sort of crowds, that in talking about different ways to optimize sleep in particular and other kinds of performance like learning and motor skills and all of that. And I was listening to some episodes he had about sleep, and it's really fascinating, and it actually dovetails really nicely with Ayurveda. And he doesn't talk about Ayurveda explicitly, but Ayurveda basically says that there's really no such thing as a night owl, that like everyone is kind of on the same clock, the same rhythm, because we're all human, and there can just be habits that form, or, maybe some people can stay up a little bit later than others, but just based on the biology of how we work, there's really no benefit to staying up late into the night. And it just kind of cycles and gets into a snowball effect of imbalances, which I think a lot of people might then be experiencing, but not even realize that they're experiencing it because it's become their baseline. So once you kind of get into it from that perspective, it's interesting to have these conversations with people where they're like, "Oh, that's just how I am," and you're like, "Maybe."
I know. Well, I think you're right about that. I think sleep's always been an issue for me. I've had like some degree of insomnia patches over my life. And I think that for me, I've certainly done things to like retrain those patterns, because I think you're right. Like, you can retrain patterns. I think for me though, a lot of times that late night time from like, I don't know, 12 a.m. to 2 a.m. 12, like that's sometimes very creative time for me. It's quiet. Everybody's asleep.
And that actually makes perfect sense from the way Ayurveda understands it. And we can kind of jump right into this if you want to talk about this. But
well, go ahead and say what you're going to say, and then we'll backtrack a little bit before we get fully into Ayurveda stuff.
Well, not to kind of, I guess, give everything in one overwhelming package, but there's basically sort of different kind of energies and rhythms to different periods of the day. And so when we look at the clock, there's a kind of a cycle to how these energies manifest. And so the 10 a.m., like 10 to 2 is thought of as the pitta time, which is the kind of fiery, transformative, digestive time. And so during the daylight hours, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., that's when we can be, really productive and energized. And we want to have our biggest meal to digest because we have a lot of that fire inside of us, but also outside of us in the sun to help us digest our food. But in the evening time, so 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., it's the same fiery energy, that same pitta energy, but it's being used for a different process. So that kind of second wave of energy, a lot of people describe it as, people can use that, for external purposes, for creativity, which absolutely makes sense in your biology, but what it's kind of designed for, I guess you could say, is to like detoxify your body while you're sleeping. So there's like a lot. So if
I'm using all that energy for other reasons,
exactly,
it won't detoxify.
Exactly. So when you wake up and you're kind of like, then you get in that snowball effect of sort of being off and like, having crashes of energy and all of that. It can really just upset your digestion. And all of this stuff happens, like your liver is basically working to process all of the all of the food that you've taken in, but Ayurveda thinks about everything as food. So all of the experiences and information, all of that's also being digested and processed, and your brain kind of gets washed in fluids to, remove all of the stuff that's clogged up in there. So it has like there's a lot happening when you're sleeping. And when you, like you said, when you direct it outwards, it just means that it's not happening internally, which, if you do it once in a while, it's not going to kill you, obviously. And it's not going to really kill you if you continue to do it for your life, because a lot of people do it, but it just might mean that how you're experiencing your waking hours might not be as optimal as they could be.
That's an interesting choice of word, optimal. Let's come back to that, though. I appreciate what you're saying, because I think that in my experience, I know that if I do too many days in a row of like you're saying, like doing too much in that time, even though it is fruitful often, I can't maintain it. Like right. I have to, and that just shows me that pattern is like, it's not one that you want to have like be the everyday pattern. But in terms of optimizing, that's an interesting question. But before we get into, we've jumped right in there because you know me, you know the show. This is sort of a interesting thing because I feel like in the time that I've known you, Jennifer, you are, in my mind, a very Renaissance person. Oh. Like you've worn many hats.
Yes. Yes.
For me, like to start, when I first met you, you basically cold emailed me about potentially helping me work on a book project. And
I actually found that email just before we got on because I was like, let me look back. And yes, I was very audacious in sending these kinds of emails to people at that time.
But I didn't find it audacious. I mean, I don't know if I have a good working definition of audacious in my mind right now. I guess it's a little bit audacious, but not really. It was very thoughtful and a great email, I have to say, because it made me feel like, oh, maybe this is somebody who could really, like, I felt like you wanted to help me. I didn't feel like you were trying to capitalize on me.
Right. Which is what I was aiming to do. So I'm glad that came off.
You definitely did. And at that time, I had already been trying to do it some on my own and really feeling at a loss. And had even like put together a list of literary agents and was trying to see if I could do something, but I was just feeling so turned off by all of it, frankly. And just like, even like, oh, it has to have the right format and font and, like trying to like structure the way everything looked. Just, I don't know. I needed help. And that's when your email came. And I just thought you were super professional. And frankly, I think it was the first time you gave me notes on something I wrote. I've worked with other editors over the years with my writing, and you just get a feeling of like, oh yeah, I that makes it better. Yeah. When someone reads something I say and they give me feedback that I personally feel like, oh yeah, I think that's better, then that, I don't know, that feels exciting. So I was glad to have had that time, even though I haven't really pursued that much further than we pursued it together. I really appreciated that first moment with you. And I'm curious, I know that since then you have moved more away from that work of being an editor. At that time, when you had reached out to me, were you still more into it? Like tell me have you completely exited that profession, or are you still doing it some?
Yeah, well, first, I'm happy to hear that the process was enjoyable for you, because I know that getting feedback on one's work in any creative capacity can be sometimes traumatizing for people. So I'm glad that was a resonant experience. And I agree. I really loved having those conversations and just immersing myself in your experience and helping to kind of shape that. And I think even the process, you said you haven't really done anything with it. I really feel, and this is sort of an answer to your question, that process of writing or investigating one's story, whether it's a personal story, and you had like a personal story in there, but you were also telling a bigger story of yoga, yoga in New York at a certain time, and kind of like periphery of that. But I feel like that work in and of itself is really valuable. And that was always the process and the part of the process that I was most drawn to and most enjoyed. I loved sort of being in the weeds with an author and kind of teasing out language and making things feel like that moment you described of like, oh yeah, like that's how it should be. And then in the publishing world though, there's so much more that happens. And, I started in an editorial position at a pretty major trade publisher right out of college in 2011 and was there until 2017 and then transitioned to like a part-time editorial position at a much smaller press in that summer. And then I wrote to you, I think it was in December of 2017. So at that point, I was sort of half in, half out because I was pursuing my 500-hour yoga teacher training and thinking to myself, I love that word renaissance. I never would have thought of that. But yes, like as a kind of, doing lots of things at once. And that's always been my personality. Even when I was working full time, I always had like 4 or 5 different side things that I was doing. Because I just had many different interests in different areas of creativity and the world and just intellectual pursuits. So I really sort of embraced that and thought, okay, well, if I deliberately kind of diversify how I'm spending my time, then it won't be like having, to put out 200% effort because I had 100% at a job and then, adding on all the extras. If I just diversify the 100% that I have, then that will be better. That will just be less energy that I have to put out. I can't say that it's completely worked out that way, of course, but that was the goal.
It was a good plan to start.
That was the goal. But yeah, so I stayed at that smaller press for about 1.5 years and then left there in January 2019. And since then have been pretty much on my own, working in various capacities in sort of writing and editing and in this kind of wellness sphere. And I say wellness because I don't have a better word for the industry. I don't really like it anymore. Wellness used to be a phrase that really, it had meaning to me, like, oh, we want to be well, but now it's become so kind of commodified and ingrained in capitalism that I just don't really like to say it. And it's not just yoga. It's not just Ayurveda. It's being a good person. And I don't know how to say that.
That really is a shame that the idea, like, because when you say wellness industry, you immediately think people selling you bullshit.
Right. Like,
which is not necessarily the case, but that's what it's come to sort of have implications for because of the way things have happened. I think it is the commodification. I think you're right about that. Exactly.
So since then I've been kind of slowly removing myself from the editorial process, which was not something that I intended. For a while, I really wanted to be a freelance editor because I thought that I could help writers with that stage of the process that we were talking about earlier.
I'll vouch for you. I will write your review. You did great with
Thank you. So that was something that I was really interested in. And then sort of other interests came up, like the yoga became a little bit more front of mind, but the yoga wasn't paying the bills. So I just kind of had I've been very fortunate in my freelance life in that a lot of opportunities have just sort of come to me. I haven't really had to hustle in the way that a lot of my colleagues and friends have had in editing and publishing and a lot of different industries, which I don't know how that happened. It's just, I guess, good fortune on my part, knock on wood. So in that time period, I was connected to different people who needed sort of like ghostwriters and collaborators on their books. And so I served that role for a couple of projects, which was extremely interesting because when you are editing something, there's kind of, there's boundaries where that like this is someone's voice and you're kind of manipulating it to a degree and trying to kind of fine tune it. When you're ghostwriting or collaborating, there can be so many different shades of involvement that the writer takes on compared to the author, whose name is going to be on the book. Mm-hmm. So in the couple of projects that I did with that, they were sort of like night and day in terms of how we worked together. But it was it was a very immersive experience and exhausting because you had to kind of become, or I had to become an expert in two things that I had no expertise in. Like I was interested in them and sort of had a casual understanding of these topics, but by no means was an expert. And there's a way in which you can, I think someone who is a writer and who kind of understands language can look at information and put together a story from it. But if you haven't kind of lived it, if that's not your story, it's not your passion, the way that you talk about it is going to be very different. So in my attempts to write those stories of other people's passions, it became clear to me that I kind of had that, there was this separation that was very uncomfortable for me. And the project went well. It's not that there was any issues in the end. And I think the books came out well too, because I enjoyed both of the people that I was writing with. So that also helped to kind of smooth out that distinction, that buffer between us. But in the end, those experiences really helped me to commit to the fact that like I had a story that I wanted to tell, and that I didn't need to always be telling other people's stories, which is essentially what the work of an editor does. And that's a very valuable job. And I still really respect it and have a handful of editorial projects that I'm still working on from kind of past clients. So nothing really new right now, but I really have committed to claiming my stake as a writer myself and a storyteller in that way through actual writing, through words, but also through Ayurveda and yoga, because I think they're both inherently acts of storytelling in different ways. And that's for me, when I look at my kind of hodgepodge of different activities and careers, that storytelling is kind of the umbrella under which they all fall. And for a long time, I remember struggling a lot when I first made my website because I had these like disparate categories, and the people I was working with on the back end of the sites, they were like, well, you want all these different pages, like they don't really make sense. Like how do they, like you can't make a visual.
We've talked about that in the yoga business class, actually. Like sometimes it would actually, if they don't go together and you have too many things, you actually want to have a separate website. You don't, if like someone's coming to you to be their editor,
right.
You don't necessarily want to see your Ayurveda stuff or your yoga stuff, but you do seem to have found a way to bridge them some.
Yeah. And it's been very, I just feel so much more kind of at peace in a way. I just don't feel like I'm in conflict with my inner voice in that way. There's people, I remember I used to get, we used to get massages and things like that. People would always say like, oh, like your throat chakra is blocked, or like there's like, they would talk about this and they would say like, you need to speak your truth. And I was like, what do you mean by truth? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't lie. I don't deceive people. And I think this was sort of, at least one of, who knows what will continue to show up. But I think this was one of the ways in which that was maybe part of what they were referring to, unbeknownst to them and to me at the time, that there's a worth to all of our experiences and stories, and unpacking that and kind of teasing that out and following it with curiosity it's the work of our lives. And we can try to shape that story and be skillful with it, and have craft in the sense that you could, if you were thinking of a pure like writing analogy, like be a good writer, quote unquote, and have pretty sentences versus just, straightforward sentences. But ultimately, we kind of have to surrender to how the story is going to happen. We can't decide. And from all of the writers that I've worked with, I would say the far majority of them have that capacity, which I don't write fiction. I write nonfiction, and I've never aspired to writing fiction. But with the fiction authors who I've worked with, the novelists, they often will say, there's this flow, this kind of untapped story that just comes to them, and they don't really have control over it. And whether it's coming to them all at once or sort of in pieces, or even if they're someone who kind of outlines or kind of maps out the story that they're going to tell, it's something that is coming from outside of them. And I know, you've talked about this a lot, and we've talked about it a lot, that sort of download process that happens when you just get the message. And sometimes that comes to us, and if we're meant to be writers, that comes to us in the form of a story, of characters, of places that we have never been to, or maybe we have been to, but it's just, a different way of expressing a shared experience. Or maybe that's a yoga class, or a recipe, or, we all have these different outlets, I think, of our stories that, when we try to conform them in certain ways, or be too rigid about it, that's when they start to fall apart and they don't make sense. In the way that if you read a book that has been overly edited, or is trying to follow a template to meet some kind of trend or genre, you can tell it doesn't work.
That's right. I totally know what you mean. This idea, like we've talked about downloading, I think of that as just part of like a creative will process. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. There's a sort of paradox to it, because it happens inside you, like it's just you inside yourself. But the feeling is that it's received, like you tune into a frequency or something, and you it is received. It just comes into you, and then it comes out of you. And then if you overwork, and then there's like a certain amount of crafting or whatever polishing that you would put on that. But if you overwork it, like if you overwork a painting or something, and then you you lose the initial essence or download of it or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, I get it. Well, that's interesting though too, that you do have these other hats. And what I was just thinking when you were thinking ahead, was that you came into your yoga in New York City, and you were saying you were doing training in 2011, but I imagine it overlaps and you started earlier. When does your yoga thing start in New York?
Yeah, so my yoga story actually goes to a little before New York. So I started when I was in college, and not that the location of where I went to college really matters, but it was before I moved to New York. So it was baked into me from the time that I came here, and I was a dancer before that. So I was very interested in movement in that way, and dance was a real joy and source of so much life and so much vitality for me. I remember distinctly when I was about to, in the process of applying for colleges and things like that, there was a really clear decision that it seemed I had to make between do I pursue dance or do I not pursue dance? I wouldn't say that I was, good in any way that I could have made it as a professional, but a lot of people study dance and different art forms without even that aspiration or expectation of doing anything professionally. And at the time, I was raised to be very focused on academics, and dance was a kind of very kind of side rail outlet for me in certain ways, because none of the other girls at my dance studio were really interested in school or studying. They were very committed to dance, or I was always felt like an outlier in a way, because I was very focused on studying and kind of scholarly pursuits, but then also really loved movement. And I would bring books to read between classes and my homework and stuff like that. And everyone was just saying, well, why do you care about that? What are you doing? At a certain point there was just not enough time, because I was taking a lot of advanced classes, and I didn't have the energy or the time in the day to do both. And so when looking into colleges, I kind of made this choice to go the more academic route, but still held on to dancing as a hobby. I was in 2 different companies in college that I really loved and enjoyed. But ultimately, I came to yoga because I had sort of developed some unhealthy habits around food and movement and just my body in general. And so when I was working with a therapist, and she knew that I was interested in dance and movement, and she thought that yoga would be a way for me to have a healthier relationship with my body and movement, because it was, calming and grounding and all of that. And she had practiced yoga, I'm sure, before, and suggested it in a completely authentic way. But I think the way that many medical people mistakenly do. She didn't really tell me what kind of yoga to do. She just said, do yoga.
That's exactly what I was just thinking, because I know people who had similar issues and just moved from dance to yoga and still carry those patterns still.
Yeah. So it wasn't, the yoga was definitely working on a very subconscious level for me, because it's funny because, I've listened to people tell their yoga stories on your show so many times, and I've had this running dialogue in my own head of what my story is. So listening to those conversations has been really helpful in me, remembering and putting together those pieces. But my story is so anticlimactic, because I hated yoga at the beginning. I enjoyed the movement and the feeling of it, but moving slowly, and I didn't know the postures. And so there was this intense frustration when I first started of like, what is this? Why do I have to do it? And I never did Shavasana. I started watching it on DVDs, and the first time
those people,
I never did Shavasana, because I would lay there and just get up and turn the DVD off. I was like, okay, we're done. I just didn't understand the point.
It was a DVD?
Yeah. It was a DVD. It wasn't a class. And this was sort of like in the summer between semesters at college. So I was at home with my parents. And so that's where I was sort of learning yoga. But again, I think when I got back to campus the next year, there were yoga classes, live yoga classes at the gym and everything. And I was taking them because I was like, okay, like I can continue to do this, and kind of negotiated with myself, like, oh, if I keep doing yoga, like it will like look good to people. Like I'll just tell them I'm doing yoga, and that's good. But that's when I really started to like the classes, because there was obviously, another person there. It was, there was connection with the teacher and the other students. And, they had the classes in this ridiculous room, on like the 4th or 5th floor of this enormous gym. And so you had to like trek up the stairs, 4 or 5 flights of stairs up to the yoga room. And then it was a room that I believe they used for fencing practice. And I don't know anything about fencing, but apparently they do things with mesh on the floor. So there were these sort of strips of mesh on the floor, like 2 kind of wide parallel lanes that we would lay our mats over perpendicularly. So I really learned yoga like on this incredibly unstable surface, which when I look back at it, it's just, I can analyze a lot about a lot of things, but I think it really shaped my experience of yoga, that like I was just
like
bouncing
it actually
around.
Wasn't a solid, like it was like springy.
It was not a solid ground. It was springy. Yeah. So it was super interesting, but the classes were still really good. And we did have one teacher who did that, like the full Shavasana, thing with the oil and the head rub and all of that. And so at that point I started to really like Shavasana. And
you see, nobody would see, not that we're even in classes, but that kind of went away, the oil in Shavasana. I used to do it, and I stopped doing it because not everybody wants you to come up without asking and rub oil on them.
Right. And I think that was a little bit, those were still sort of earlier, before I think those conversations about touch were really more prominent. Yeah. This was like 2008, 2009. So it was still like, in the ether. So from there, after I left college and moved to New York, I was thinking like, okay, well, what am I going to do, for my movement? I didn't really have much money because I was working in publishing. So, I didn't really want to join a gym. And I took a couple of dance classes at Steps on Broadway, and was just completely blown out of the water. Like I remember going to an intermediate tap class thinking like, okay, like I'll definitely be able to handle this. I had tap dance since I was 3 years old. I was like, I've got this. And these people who were in the class were clearly, regulars for, their whole lives. They had a routine. They knew it completely backward and forward, and the teacher did not teach it or break it down in any way. So I was very humbled by that, and thought, okay, I'm not going to spend $25 a class to experience this. So
to feel shitty about my dance.
Right. So I actually found YogaWorks, because YogaWorks was one of the DVDs that I had when I was first learning yoga, and I thought, okay, well, let me try that. And I wound up going to the studio and practicing there. There was another place that I practiced. I lived on the Upper West Side, and it was a very local, a local studio, and it was above this bakery on 105th Street and Broadway. And I just have always had this very clear sensory association between the smell of like yeasty bread and yoga.
So, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And then and for some reason, I just thought that was the smell of the studio. I didn't make that connection until I went to other places and they didn't have that smell.
Not all yoga studios smell like yeasty bread. Yeah. Well, maybe they do.
Right. Well, that's why I thought it was like, okay, people are sweaty. Maybe this is the smell. But
that wasn't New York yoga, was it? That's not the place you're talking about.
No, it was called Life in Motion. I have been to a place though called New York Loves Yoga, which maybe is that what you're thinking of?
No, there was a place up there that I remember.
Yeah, on 83rd Street, and I did practice there for a while. And they're great people. I love them. Wonderful teachers. I lived on on 83rd and Riverside for a couple of years. And so they were really close by, and I really enjoyed that studio a lot. So I kind of came to New York through a backwards door of my DVD experience, but YogaWorks was really great when I was there. I found some wonderful teachers who helped me to just not only deepen my interest in yoga, but it was a really challenging time for me personally, and professionally, because work was very stressful and yoga was incredibly therapeutic in that way. I remember just being able to go to class and cry, and just because of what had happened that day or because of anything going on. And I used to practice at the 7:30 at night classes, like 7:30 to 8:45. And now it's so different. I would never take a vinyasa class at 7:30 at night. And I can't even imagine doing that. But I did. And, it served a purpose, and it was really transformative. And I'm so grateful for all of my teachers there who I'm still in touch with, a lot of them. But as we know, YogaWorks is no longer in New York City. But
well, I was not thinking that, but I was just thinking to myself how interesting it is to me, because when we were working on that book project I was talking about this time in New York yoga scene, right? Mm-hmm. When I first got there, which is essentially 15 years before you.
Yeah.
And so to think of that, I was already in Brooklyn by that time. Mm-hmm. And to just think of you as like a generation after me, and how much, again, I'm always thinking about the way things have evolved over time. And then, as you just mentioned, there is no more YogaWorks in New York City. I guess I'm wondering, you said you were doing training. Did you do all of your training at YogaWorks, or did you train other places, or was it at YogaWorks? It
was all at YogaWorks, and it took me a while to do training. So I moved to New York in 2011, and then I wound up doing my first training in, I think it must have started in 2015. So 2015 to 16. And it was the extended 6-month version because I was still working full time. But it was a great training, and I loved my trainers, and I'd still work with them, in various ways. So, it was really transformative. And I have the fondest memory of, well, I don't know if fond is the right word, but I remember the very first day of teacher training. The first thing we did was, she had us put our mats up against the wall and basically push our feet into the wall, with legs straight, to understand what Tadasana was, and to feel your legs engage. It felt like we were holding that pose for an hour. And I just thought to myself, what did I get myself into? Because I liked the kind of flow, the music, the lights, the candles. I was like, we are not flowing. We are stuck against the wall right now. And it was so hard. But I remember at the end of that training, I have never felt as good in my body as I did at the end of that teacher training, which I won't say was it probably wasn't completely healthy, but I remember feeling extremely just vital and alive, in a way that I hadn't really experienced before. And, I mentioned at the beginning that, I do some running, and all of my life I had never been able to run. I had some knee issues from dance and hypermobility, which I didn't realize until I was in yoga teacher training, but I would run for like a minute and just my knees would be completely in pain and I wouldn't be able to walk for like the rest of the way, if I was going somewhere. So I never was able to run. But then in yoga teacher training, we discovered that I have hypermobility and, I gained some strength in my quadriceps. And so the knee pain sort of went away. And so if nothing else, I definitely gained that from yoga teacher training of like no more knee pain. So little things like that, I think, were what made me feel so good. It helped me to understand that I could change, like if I put my mind to it, and that, all of the things that we discussed in our classes and sessions and the people I met, it felt to me for the first time like I wasn't competing with other people for worthiness in the way that I had always felt in academic settings and in publishing in a way, because publishing is a very as much as it is cerebral and kind of, there's this kind of, I think myth of the editor in their ivory tower and their red pen, and they just, never emerge and produce beautiful things. But that's not really the truth of it. There's a lot of schmoozing and wheeling and dealing that has to happen that I was never really good at or interested in. And so for me, there was this deep conflict when I was in that world more intensely, that I had to kind of perform in a way in order to get ahead in my job, in order not only to get ahead, but to get anywhere, to like be a viable person in the company of someone who is acquiring books and producing things that are of worth. In that context, like I had to do these things that were so against my nature. And so in yoga, I didn't really have to do that anymore. And of course, there's a lot of competition and a lot of wheeling and dealing and all of that happens. But, at the beginning, when you're just in yoga teacher training, you don't necessarily are exposed to that.
Well, it's interesting again, because it sounds to me still, again, when 15 years earlier, when I was making similar choices about what I want to do with myself, it was like a counterculture move or whatever, or it was I don't want to work in an office kind of choice. I want to find a way where I feel like I can express myself. And I relate to the performance element too, even just having been like in acting training in the past, or even some dance stuff that I did, there was always a certain amount of like external approval that was attached to like the performance. Like I would love the rehearsal process, but like then you would have like the run of the show. And then it would end, And I think that yoga became a place where there's a performance element there, but it wasn't about approval from anybody. It was just like, Am I going to feel okay?
Right. And I think the performance within a yoga class, and I know that you've been exploring this a little bit more lately yourself in your own practice. I think that there's nothing wrong with performing intrinsically. I always, thinking about my dance experience, I always loved the warm-ups of dance class. Like we could just do warm-ups like all day and I would be happy, which is what I kind of equate to as the like yoga, the stretching and the kind of, the little kind of exercises that you do in order to like feel limber in your body.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.